China is marking the 80th anniversary of its victory in the Chinese People's War of Resistance against Japanese aggression and the World Anti-Fascist War. China suffered huge losses in the war with Japan, including more than 35 million casualties. But Chinese resistance was also critical to Japan's defeat. For decades, stories of Western victories in both Europe and Asia during the Second World War have dominated, but that narrative is starting to change. We begin with this report from CGTN's Victor Ning.
August 1945. The U.S. drops 2 atomic bombs in Japan, first Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. The war against Japan came to an end soon after. Many Western historians say these bombs were the reason Japan surrendered. However, 80 years on, history is being more fully revealed.
The Chinese government solemnly commemorates the 80th anniversary of the Chinese People's War of Resistance against Japanese aggression and the World Anti-Fascist War to remember history, cherish the memory of the martyrs, cherish peace, and create the future. Any country that faces history with integrity and honesty and is truly committed to peaceful development, it will no doubt or even object to this intention.
The historical truth is that China bore the brunt of the anti-fascist war against the militarized Japan, beginning in 1931 when Tokyo invaded northeast China. 35 million Chinese casualties in 14 years of fighting, which tied up the vast majority of Imperial Japan's forces. Western historians have tended to focus on Western victories such as the Normandy landings, D-Day in 1944. And when officials in the U.S. talk about Japan today, they tend to speak in a very neutral tone. After 1945, Japan was occupied and became a key ally in the Pacific. This recent statement from the U.S. State Department raised eyebrows across Asia, where memories of Japanese aggression and brutal occupation have not faded even 80 years on.
80 years ago, the United States and Japan concluded a devastating war in the Pacific. For 80 years, the United States and Japan, however, have stood shoulder to shoulder to safeguard peace and prosperity in the Pacific.
Even when depicting the war in the Pacific in China, Western culture has tended to focus on U.S. contributions in the anti-fascist war.
The catastrophic impact on the civilian population of the Japanese invasion of China and the Nanjing massacre in particular, it must be remembered.
The recent Chinese blockbuster Dead to Rights portrays the massacre of Nanjing, which began in December 1937. 300,000 Chinese citizens killed during 6 weeks of brutality by the Japanese. The spectacular Dongji Rescue, a portrayal of heroic Chinese fishermen rescuing hundreds of about-to-drown British prisoners of war. These 2 movies are helping correct the Western-dominated narrative with audiences.
One of the things I remember from that time is thinking, oh, the world was crazy back then, but it'll never be crazy like that again. And I worry now from time to time when I see craziness come up in people that it could happen again. And I think that reminders like this in the form of movies are important.
China's pivotal role as a major battleground and contributor in the global fight against fascism is now being recognized more than ever. Even 80 years on, a full and complete history can shape international understanding now and for future generations to come. Victor Ning, CGTN, Washington.
Later in the show, we will get a broader view of the conflict from author and former Professor Diana Lary, and we'll also hear about the role of the Flying Tigers, a group of U.S. volunteer pilots who fought alongside the Chinese against Japan during World War II. But first, a Chinese perspective on the extraordinary sacrifices China made and the resilience it showed in defeating fascism. Joining us now is Victor Ga. He is chair professor at Soochow University. Victor, great to see you. China, of course, played a major role in the defeat of fascism during World War II. But if we look at the way history is told right now, China's role is often downplayed in the West. We don't hear much about the tens of millions of Chinese that sacrificed their lives to save China, to save its people, to make the world a safer place. What more should the world know about China's efforts?
Thank you very much. You are raising a very important question. First of all, in terms of the length of time involved in this war of resistance against Japanese aggressors, China fought altogether 14 years from 1931 all the way to the victory in August 1945. This was in contrast to a little bit short of 4 years the Americans fought against the Japanese aggressors after the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. And also it set in sharp contrast to the Soviet Union's involvement in the war against the Japanese aggressors, which actually happened only in the last few days of the before Japan unconditionally surrendered. So this is number one. Number two is that China played a crucial role in almost 10 years leading up to the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor by refusing to surrender, because Japan originally calculated that they would launch surprise attack against China, achieve a quick win in a matter of, let's say, 1 month, 2 months, or 3 months maximum. However, what exactly happened was that in China, we created what we call an ocean of people's resistance against Japanese occupiers. And eventually, lots of Japanese soldiers and manpower and materials were sucked into this Chinese people's ocean of resistance against Japanese aggression. At the height, China actually drew more than 3 million Japanese soldiers engaged in different parts of China. And even though at the height of the Japanese aggression, Japan occupied almost half of the landmass of China and managed to close almost the total length of the Chinese coastline, China still refused to surrender to Japan. China kept fighting on and on again. And the national capital actually was changed, moved from Nanjing, which was eventually massacred by Japanese aggressors, to other major cities, eventually ending up in Chongqing, in the deep southwestern part of China. Now, this resilience, this resolve, this refusal to surrender actually mobilized lots of people in other countries, especially in the United States, to enable them to see that the Chinese people were fighting on the side of justice, saving its own nation, saving its own culture and civilization against the very brutal, very evil Japanese fascists, for example.
Now, there were major commemorations that were held in Beijing this week to mark the Chinese victory over Japan. How significant are these commemorations in reminding the Chinese people about the role the country played in defeating fascism?
Allow me to emphasize one point. The celebrations are not only for the victory of the Chinese people's war of resistance against Japanese fascism, it's also celebration of the world's anti-fascism war, of which the Chinese people's war of resistance against Japanese aggression and fascism is a very much integral part of that. So we celebrate both the victory for the Chinese people as well as victory for the American people, for countries like Britain, Australia, etc., who all pitched in the fight against Japanese aggressors. Also including the very important contribution of the former Soviet Union when they crushed the Japanese occupiers and the Japanese soldiers in the northeastern part of China, the Manchukuo, which was the name given to that part of China at that time. So I think it's a celebration of both the Chinese victory as well as people in the world's victory against Japanese fascism. Of course, China wants to let everyone in the world know that China made the great contribution in defeating Japanese fascism, not only because of the total length of 14 years involved and Chinese commitment never to surrender to the Japanese occupiers and Chinese resolve to continue fighting against the Japanese occupiers until the last minute, until we really achieve overwhelming victory against the Japanese occupiers. Now, how that could be possible, because at that time, Japan was much stronger as a military power against China. China was very weak, very fragmented for a while. And even after the United Front was formed in China, rallying all people in China in this United Front against Japanese occupier, China was still weak. And the fact that the United States came into the fight declaring war on Japan really helped the Chinese nation. But allow me to mention one point. Even if the United States did not declare war on Japan and did not come into the fight against the Japanese occupiers, China would have continued the fight by itself till the very last minute, till the very last Chinese standing. Why? Because by the Nanjing massacre, by the Japanese rape of Nanjing, we became fully convinced that the Japanese fascism is evil. They not only want to kill the Chinese people, they want to wipe out the Chinese culture and eliminate the Chinese civilization, which existed for more than 5,000 years.
Victor, 80 years on, how does China's fight against fascism resonate with the Chinese people today?
Well, I think all the Chinese people remember what had happened before the Japanese unconditional surrender very well. And you know, the national anthem of China is still the People's Volunteers March, which was written in the darkest hours of the Japanese occupation of China. And in that national anthem, one phrase is very typical. It says, China has reached the most critical and most dangerous moment in its history. We want to build a great wall of Chinese flesh and bones to fight against the aggressors. Now, this anthem, which was so inspiring during the war, remains the Chinese national anthem. So you can see that every Chinese citizen, every national in China, knows about the great perils China went through in the Japanese occupation of China, in their attempt to enslave the Chinese nation, to wipe out the Chinese culture. And we kept fighting against the occupiers and the aggressors until the complete triumph, until the unconditional surrender of Japanese fascism. I think this really reveals the resilience and the resolve of the Chinese nation. Never surrender to the occupiers, and keep fighting till the very last minute. And we are fully convinced that China cannot be wiped out. The Chinese civilization will always stand, and the Japanese fascism will be swept into the dustbin of history.
We are at a time now when we see rising nationalism, isolationism, militarism resurfacing. How important is multilateralism to avoid a repetition of this history?
Well, multilateralism actually was the original purpose of the founding of the international order founded back in 1945. If you look at the composition of the 5 permanent member states of the United Nations Security Council, each with a veto power, you will see that the international order founded in 1945 was not meant to be sole or unipolar. It's meant to be multipolar. Multipolarity should be the way going forward. Therefore, emphasizing multipolarity, emphasizing multilateralism is the only right thing to do. Never allow any country to pretend that it had a mandate to be the unipole in the world. No, that was not the current international order meant to be, and we need to wake up everyone. This world is a world of multipolarity.
Victor Gao, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
And for more perspective, joining me now is Diana Lary. She is an author and professor emerita at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Professor Lary, thanks so much for joining us. Your book, The Chinese People at War, details very vividly the profound human suffering endured by the Chinese people during that war of resistance against Japan. That was the period from 1937 to 1945. What can you tell us about this period, what China went through and how it shaped the country?
Well, this was the most terrible war imaginable, and something that China, in all its dealings with foreign aggression, hadn't even imagined. Basically from 1931, the Japanese kept on encroaching on China, and in 1937, all-out war. The government was forced to move into the interior to Chongqing. Millions, tens of millions fled. The Japanese in North China especially behaved with, one can only say, extreme brutality. The rape of Nanjing in the end of 1937, 1938 is very well known, but it was only one of many such terrible, terrible happenings. But the Chinese fought on, and for much of the war, there was stalemate, and then in late 1941, early 1942, the Pacific War started, and then there was some hope that eventually Japan would be defeated. But until then, China was basically at the mercy of Japan. There are all kinds of sub-stories I find terribly moving. They took, again, hundreds of thousands of girls whom I think tragically are still referred to as comfort women, but were effectively sex slaves. They laid waste to all of China's foreign trade. China had no foreign trade for that entire period of the war. They bombed many of the cities in the interior ceaselessly for many years. And out of this, it's a sad victory, but out of this, China still did not surrender. So it's a terrible story, but it's also a story of survival.
Now, as you mentioned, the Japanese were already involved in China in 1931. They had already invaded Manchuria. So what led to the escalation in 1937?
Japan was on just a great desire to be as strong and as powerful as any of the other imperial powers. That would be Britain, first of all, and then France. And they wanted a great East Asia dominated by Japan. Their slogan was the Great East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. That's quite a mouthful with that little word sphere on the end. And some people would say they came close to achieving it, but China held them up. And the other people who held them up somewhat was the Soviet Union, because they would also, a lot of what they did was in the name of fighting communism, i.e. the Soviet Union. But the Japanese ambition was something that's very, very hard to understand in China, that Japan actually wanted to take over China. And looking back in history, it also was one of these rather strange dreams that countries sometimes get.
There is something known as the Marco Polo Bridge incident, also the Lugao Bridge incident.
That was the eventual pretext, but anything could have done it. And the Marco Polo Bridge was probably staged. You know, was probably apparently a group of Japanese soldiers were attacked, and as a result, Japan, which was already completely prepared for a major invasion, just said, "That's it. We've had enough. We're invading." Every impression at the time, though, was that this was just a pretext and a staged event.
The Chinese mounted a vigorous resistance. They did not capitulate to the Japanese. Can you tell us a little bit about the stories of courage, of stoicism amid all these atrocities? You know, as you pointed out, there were things like forced labor. There was the bombing of civilians as well.
The general feeling is that the Chinese just weren't going to give in. They realized, I think, fairly as the war progressed, but even in the early stages, that this was in effect a race war, because the Chinese, whether they resisted or not, were going to be killed, whether they were civilians or soldiers.
Sometimes history is presented in very broad strokes, but in your recounting of the history of that period in China and of the war and of what happened, to what extent did you focus on the personal stories of the families that were involved, families that were torn apart, children who were left destitute and homeless as well?
Well, I focused, I would have to say, largely on that, partly because I've lived in China and often talk to people about their families' experiences. partly because I was myself brought up in the after the Second World War, and all of my elder people never stopped talking about the war, so I was quite used to hearing people talk about wartime experiences. But then I realized how sad so many of the Chinese experiences had been. There wasn't the kind of, there was some moments of courage, the courage under bombardment, under the bombing, that was very well celebrated.
And what was the West's view on what was happening at the time? I mean, did China receive any support from the West? There was something called the China Campaign Committee that was in Britain. It was one example of the sort of sympathy that China received from the West, and there were some major cultural figures who were involved in reporting this war, people like Robert Capa, W.H. Auden, the writer, as well as Henri Cartier-Bresson. They all brought their talents to telling the world what was going on, but was there any more support from the West?
You're missing one huge group, which is the missionaries,
right,
and the Christian churches at the time in North America, in England. They all provided a tremendous amount of really practical support. Doctors, quite a few famous doctors who worked either with the communist forces or elsewhere. And people like Pearl Buck, the writer Pearl Buck, who was a huge figure in America at the time, she wrote constantly about China and brought a great deal of support, and films were made of her books too. So they certainly weren't lacking in sympathy, but the sympathy couldn't be turned into practical help. First of all, because America was determined to stay out of the war. I mean, the Chinese actually regard Pearl Harbor not as, a great Japanese effrontery, but Pearl Harbor was the one thing, the one huge Japanese mistake, which forced America into the war. There was really, even leading up to Pearl Harbor, there was very little sense that the Americans would join the war, and that included, of course, the war in Europe. So, in a way, the Japanese, you could say they were the masters of their own defeat in the end, as one of their admirals said at the time, "We've won this battle, but we'll lose the war." Practical help, there wasn't forthcoming. Remember, the Depression was on throughout the West. So they got a certain amount of help from overseas communities, quite a lot actually, but they're overseas Chinese communities. But other than that, this was a war that they had to fight on their own.
Professor Diana Lary, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you.
Many US volunteer pilots fought alongside the Chinese in the fight to defeat Japan during the Second World War. They were known as the Flying Tigers. And for more on their heroic story, I'm joined now by Lary Jobe. He is the president of the Flying Tiger Historical Organization. Lary, thanks so much for joining us. The American volunteer group, which later became known as the Flying Tigers, it was a unit of American pilots who fought with China against the Japanese during World War II. They were only in combat for 7 months, and despite their small numbers, they were highly effective. To what do you attribute their success?
Well, I think their effectiveness and their fame, if you will, was twofold. First of all, General Soochow was a tactical genius and an aviation expert, and he understood how to deploy the P-40 against the Zero, and he trained his pilots accordingly. And the second thing is, all the news in the early part of World War II was very bleak. The only shining light was China and the AVG against the Japanese. Consequently, the media picked up on it, and they got a lot of publicity because the Allies were looking for good news. And so they became famous almost overnight and got a lot more publicity than they might have otherwise.
You've accompanied several flying tigers on their return to China, and you've seen firsthand the affection that the Chinese people have for these pilots. Talk to us about that and about their legacy.
Yes, I have. I've been able and very fortunate to accompany several flying tigers back to China to visit back in the early 2000s. And quite frankly, on our first trip, the reception they received was really hard to believe. You know, you had to watch it for a while, and then you realized that it was genuine and it wasn't just put on for show. And one of the things is the Chinese, and particularly the young children, even the grammar school kids, know who the flying tigers are. And they consider them heroes. In my country, or in this country, they didn't even know who the flying tigers were. If you ask people today, a good 70% wouldn't know. We were at one city, and a little child on the walk, we're just walking down the walk, comes running up to one of the flying tigers and yanks on his pants, and he says, "You hero, you hero." They all knew who they were. The Chinese were not given the credit they should have for the success of the flying tigers. And let me qualify at this point, the Chinese don't divide the forces that fought in China into various groups like we do over here. If you fought in China in World War II, as far as they're concerned, you were a flying tiger. That includes the China-Burma-India pilots, it includes the fighter pilots, it includes the bomber pilots, mechanic, ground personnel, everybody. Anyway, we had a couple of times that we had flying tigers with us that were shot down over China and rescued by Chinese villagers. Now, there's two things that are really important here. One, if you got shot down over enemy territory in China and picked up by Chinese villagers, you had a 95% chance of getting back to your base alive. Now, that's almost a guarantee. You have to understand that the Japanese offered large rewards for flying tigers, and they also tortured villagers in order to try to find the flying tigers, and the Chinese didn't cave.
One of the institutions that emerged in the aftermath of World War II was the United Nations. It was an organization that was created to ensure that we wouldn't see the kind of conflict, the kind of international conflict that took place at that time. In fact, this October, the United Nations will be commemorating its 80th anniversary. What do you make of its accomplishments so far?
Well, I'm going to kind of paraphrase it a little because I'm not sure I'm getting the question completely right, but if we're talking about the importance of cooperation on the international scene, I think that goes without question. And I think the example that the flying tigers set in China in World War II and the Chinese shows you how far you can go with cooperation, understanding, and friendship. And I think the flying tigers built a bridge that we can cross today because they are so revered in China that we can get together and resolve our differences. There is no question in my mind that just as the 20th century was the century of the U.S., the 21st century is going to be the century of the Chinese. And by the two great powers cooperating and working together, we have a much better chance of making a better world for everybody. And I think that would be the legacy that the flying tigers would like to see. Cross that bridge, cooperate in friendship, not in anger.
Larry, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And we need to leave it there. Thanks for watching another edition of The Heat.